I couldn't believe my ears when the security guard leaned in and said, "You need to see this." My hands tightened around the leather handle of my briefcase as I stepped into the lobby of the building at 1420 Fifth Avenue, the polished marble floor reflecting the morning sunlight streaming through tall windows. Every step echoed softly, each sound bouncing off the high ceilings, and I felt the subtle weight of the Mont Blanc pen in my pocket, the engraved letters glinting faintly under the warm amber light. I hadn't come here to discover anything unusual, just a routine morning, a quick visit to drop off some papers for Evelyn at what I thought was her ordinary office. Yet, something in the guard's tone, the careful way he kept glancing over his shoulder, made me pause at the foot of the grand staircase leading to the elevators. My eyes traced the path Evelyn had taken moments earlier, noting the way she held herself, the purposeful stride that didn't match the woman I thought I knew. She was carrying a slim black folder, the corners slightly bent, its contents hidden from view, and as she passed the reception desk, I saw the receptionist's brief, subtle change in expression, an almost imperceptible lift of the eyebrows that spoke volumes if you knew what to look for. I waited just long enough to see Evelyn disappear behind the double doors leading to the elevators, my pulse quickening, and I realized I had never noticed how quiet the lobby could be in mid-morning, almost eerily so, with only the distant hum of the air vents and the soft shuffle of polished shoes against marble. I could feel my chest tightening as I considered the possibilities, each one spinning through my mind with the precision of an engineer calculating tolerances, the Mont Blanc pen pressing lightly against my palm, as if reminding me to observe every detail. I stepped closer to the elevators, listening for the soft click of the floor buttons, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The guard lingered a few feet behind me, his eyes scanning the surroundings, and he gave a subtle nod toward the closed doors that concealed Evelyn from view, and I felt a chill at the thought of what might be behind them. My mind raced through the past 30 years of our marriage, replaying the ordinary routines, the minor inconsistencies I had noticed but pushed aside, the vague mentions of late nights at the office, the hushed phone calls, the unexplained trips that Evelyn always brushed off with a casual excuse. I reminded myself to stay calm, to let my eyes and ears gather what they could without revealing my growing awareness. I moved to the side, letting the security guard take the lead, noting the pattern of the carpets underfoot, the subtle variations in lighting that might reveal a shadow or a hint of movement, and I felt the familiar thrill of discovery that always accompanied my professional work, now redirected into observing the woman I had trusted most. The Mont Blanc pen shifted in my hand as I unconsciously rotated it, feeling its weight, its balance, grounding me in the moment while my mind cataloged every small detail, the angle of the sunlight, the faint reflection of the ceiling lights on the folder, the slight rustle of papers as Evelyn passed through the reception, the low murmur of distant conversations carried on the ventilation system. I took careful steps toward the elevators, making mental notes of the floor number she had pressed, the precise timing between each movement, the way her shoes clicked against the marble with deliberate rhythm. My pulse steadied as I focused on the sequence, understanding that each seemingly trivial observation could be critical, and I reminded myself that the guard's warning was the key that had unlocked my attention, the initial trigger that would guide the entire unfolding of what might be a decades-long secret. I leaned against the side wall, feeling the cool smoothness of the marble, and allowed my gaze to linger on the elevator doors, replaying in my mind the subtle cues, the fleeting gestures, the way Evelyn's posture had shifted as she passed the security guard, the slight tightening of her grip on the folder, the barely perceptible nod she gave to someone just out of my line of sight. Every detail mattered, and I cataloged them with the same methodical precision I had applied to my engineering work for over 30 years, translating physical observations into a map of potential significance, while the guard's presence behind me reinforced the urgency of the moment. As the elevator doors began to open, I felt a rush of anticipation mixed with careful restraint, the weight of the Mont Blanc pen grounding me, my mind racing through hypotheses of what Evelyn could be hiding, and I silently resolved to follow every step, document every movement, and process every clue without jumping to conclusions. The doors parted, revealing an empty elevator interior bathed in warm fluorescent light, and I stepped inside, the guard close behind, the hum of the elevator's machinery underscoring the tension. I pressed the button for the top floor, and as the numbers lit up in sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I felt the familiar thrill of anticipation, each floor bringing me closer to uncovering a truth that had been meticulously concealed. My eyes never left the doors at the other end. The way the light fell across the polished metal, the way shadows shifted along the walls, the soft sound of her footsteps echoing faintly ahead, and I understood that the moment of revelation was imminent, that every careful observation, every noted gesture, every internal calculation had built toward this one point. I reminded myself to breathe steadily, to keep my voice calm, to let the observation guide me, and as the elevator chimed softly at the 5th floor, the door slid open with a quiet hiss, and I stepped out into the hallway, the guard trailing silently, the scent of fresh paint and polished floors filling my senses. Ahead, a partially open door revealed the edge of a mahogany desk, papers neatly stacked, and a glimmer of light reflecting off a metal nameplate that caught my attention and made my stomach tighten. I moved closer, the Mont Blanc pen ready in my hand as a tactile anchor, my mind noting the distance, the angle, the subtle hints in posture, and the faint murmur of voices inside. And then I froze again as the guard whispered softly, "This is it. You need to see everything." And I realized that whatever lay beyond that door would change the way I understood 30 years of shared life, leaving me suspended in a moment of quiet anticipation, heart pounding but measured, every sense sharply tuned, waiting to cross the threshold and uncover what had been hidden from me all these years. I stepped back from the elevator at 8:50 a.m. and let the doors close without me, the soft chime fading into the lobby air, and I stood still for a moment, the Mont Blanc pen pressing lightly against my palm, the way it always did when I needed to slow my thoughts down and let the evidence organize itself. The lobby around me continued its ordinary rhythm. A courier dropping off a package at the reception desk, a woman in a gray coat adjusting her badge lanyard, the overhead lights humming faintly. And I let that rhythm anchor me while my mind moved backward, the way an engineer reviews schematics before committing to a diagnosis, starting at the beginning and tracing every point where the measurements had not added up. 30 years. That was the number that kept presenting itself, not as an accusation but as a span of time within which patterns had formed, and I had simply failed to read them correctly. I remembered the Thanksgiving of 2019, a dinner at her sister's house in Westchester, the kind of evening where conversation filled every pause and no one noticed anything unusual except me. Because at 7:14 p.m. Evelyn's phone had vibrated once against the table, and she had glanced at the screen for no more than 2 seconds before placing it face down and resuming the conversation without the slightest change in expression, and I had filed that away as nothing, a work notification, a calendar reminder, the kind of thing that happened to everyone. I remembered March of 2022, a Saturday morning, the dry cleaning pickup, the way I had reached into the inside pocket of her charcoal blazer to check whether she had left anything before walking out the door, and I had found a business card, cream-colored, heavy stock, the name printed in small sans serif letters, Hartwell Ventures LLC, with a phone number and no other identifying information. She had been standing at the kitchen counter and I had held it up, and she had not hesitated, not a fraction of a second, before she said it was a client referral, someone she had met at a conference, a card she should have thrown away months ago. I had handed it back to her, and she had placed it in the recycling bin, and that was the end of it. And I had gone to pick up the dry cleaning, and I had not thought about it again until this morning. I thought about it now. I thought about the phone calls that came in after 9. In the evening, the ones she took in the study with the door closed, not locked, just closed, the kind of closed that communicated preference rather than secrecy, the kind I had always respected without question. I thought about January of 2021 when she had attended 4 consecutive Friday evening meetings at what she described as a professional development group, and I had asked once, casually, what the group discussed, and she had said leadership frameworks, and I had nodded, and that had been the entire conversation. I thought about the way she organized her personal files, color-coded tabs I had never been invited to review, a small locked drawer in her home desk that she had said contained client documents she was not permitted to share, and I had accepted that explanation because it was plausible, because it was the kind of explanation a reasonable person gives, and a reasonable person accepts, and I had always considered myself reasonable above all else. I thought about the annual reports I had glimpsed briefly on her screen, columns of numbers I had never connected to anything because I had not known what I was looking for. I pulled the Mont Blanc pen from my pocket and held it under the lobby light, tilting the barrel until the engraving caught the reflection clearly, and I read the small text for the first time with complete attention. Hartwell Ventures, 2021. The lobby hum continued around me, steady and indifferent, and I stood with the pen in my hand and let that detail settle into the framework I was building, one measured breath at a time. The courier at the desk picked up his receipt and walked out through the glass doors. The woman in the gray coat disappeared into an elevator. My phone buzzed once in my coat pocket, and I looked at the screen. It was Evelyn calling me, from somewhere inside this very building, and I understood that whatever I did in the next 10 seconds would determine everything that followed. I followed quietly as Evelyn exited the office, her movements deliberate, her steps measured on the polished corridor tiles. I stayed just far enough behind to avoid detection, my eyes tracing the subtle gestures that had previously escaped notice. The way she adjusted her jacket, the faint tap of her heels in rhythm, the gentle tilt of her head as she spoke softly into a smartphone. The hallway stretched before us, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that allowed the morning light to fall in long, slanted beams across the carpet, illuminating small dust motes that danced in the brightness. And I noted the contrast between the warm glow of the sun and the clinical precision of the office, observing how each reflection revealed details previously hidden in shadow. I recorded silently, committing to memory the position of furniture, the angle of doors, the subtle markings on nameplates that could indicate access levels or authority, and I felt the Mont Blanc pin in my pocket, a tactile reminder of careful observation. She exited the building onto the street, the city bustling with mid-morning energy, cars passing slowly by, pedestrians navigating the sidewalks, and I maintained a discreet distance, my coat blending into the neutral tones of the urban environment. I watched Evelyn cross the street, noting the rhythm of her stride, the way she scanned the crowd, the subtle cues in her posture that suggested anticipation or planning. She entered a nearby cafe, a place I had never associated with her routines, and I positioned myself at a distant table, the hum of conversation and the aroma of coffee enveloping me as I observed her interactions with the barista, her calm demeanor masking the complexity of her hidden life. Each gesture, each micro-expression, provided new data, and I made mental notes of the timing of her orders, the items she requested, and the casual way she communicated, every detail a potential insight into patterns of behavior that had gone unnoticed. After a brief wait, she departed again, heading toward a side street lined with boutique offices and small professional firms. I followed, mindful of my own visibility, noting the changing textures underfoot, the subtle shifts in sunlight as buildings cast shadows, the reflective surfaces of windows and doors that could either reveal or conceal her presence. She approached a low-rise office building with frosted glass panels and a discreet entrance, and I slowed my pace, observing the way she interacted with the security system, swiping a card, entering a code, gestures I had never seen before, indicating access to areas of the building I had not been aware existed. My mind cataloged each observation, the sequences of actions, the precise timings, the spacing between steps, and I felt the familiar analytical pulse of understanding forming, connecting threads that had previously seemed disparate. I noticed a side door partially ajar as she passed, and I took note of the small plaque on the adjacent wall, the etched letters catching the light, the indication of a department or division I had never encountered, and I considered how this fit into the broader picture of her concealed responsibilities. She moved toward a glass-walled office on the second floor, and I paused briefly, noting the way the sunlight fell across her desk, the faint reflection of her computer screen revealing lines of text, the position of documents, and the slight tilt of her chair, all of which suggested a meticulous, controlled environment. I calculated my approach, ensuring that my presence remained undetected while allowing me to observe the most critical details, her interactions with an assistant, the subtle signaling of documents passed across the desk, the ordering of materials that suggested ongoing management of resources and responsibilities I had not been privy to. The assistant left the office momentarily, and I took the opportunity to note the arrangement of objects on the desk. A small stack of papers with color-coded tabs, a silver pen lying diagonally across a legal pad, a laptop screen angled away just enough to obscure the full content, but revealing enough to suggest the nature of the work. Each element was a piece of the puzzle, and I mentally mapped the spatial relationships, the timing of movements, the sequence of actions, building a cognitive model of her operational routine. I followed her as she walked through a narrow corridor toward an adjoining building, noting the subtle changes in lighting, the transition from carpet to polished hardwood, the way doors were labeled and secured, and the measured manner in which she moved, as though rehearsed and precise, an orchestrated pattern maintained over years. My pulse remained steady, my breathing controlled, my attention fixed on the interplay of movement, light, and detail, cataloging each element without interruption. I noticed a brief interaction with a delivery person, a subtle exchange of papers, the way Evelyn's hand covered certain motions, the tilt of her head suggesting awareness of being observed, and I recorded all of it silently, understanding that each microbehavior could be critical in reconstructing the full scope of her concealed life. The street outside remained active, with the soft hum of traffic, the occasional bicycle bell, the faint scent of fresh pastries from nearby cafes mixing with the city air, and I maintained the careful balance of distance and observation, moving when shadows provided cover and pausing when reflections risked revealing my presence. As she entered a small office suite, keycard swiping, I noted the sequence, the timing, the controlled precision of her gestures, and I realized that every detail I had observed, from the lobby to this point, formed a continuous chain of evidence, each step confirming the sophistication of her hidden life. I took a final mental snapshot before retreating slightly to avoid detection, noting the layout, the positions of furniture, the items on desks, the direction of windows, the flow of light, the pattern of movement, and the subtle cues in her posture, preparing for the next step where a trusted ally would confirm the implications of these observations, the cumulative knowledge building toward an understanding that would soon require deliberate action without revealing my presence. I arrived at Charles Norton's law office at 10:10 a.m., the polished mahogany desk gleaming under the soft overhead lighting, and I stepped carefully to avoid disturbing the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the faint tapping of keys from the secretary at the front desk. I placed my briefcase on the floor beside me and reached into my coat pocket to feel the weight of the Mont Blanc pen, its solid presence grounding me as I prepared to recount the sequence of observations I had gathered so far. Charles rose from his chair, glancing briefly at the laptop screen displaying the folders I had sent ahead digitally, his brow furrowed with concentration as he scrolled through the detailed records, the numerical data of accounts and transfers stretching over a decade, each entry methodically timestamped and categorized. I noticed the faint reflection of the fluorescent lights in the screen and how the lines of text were crisp, precise, evidence of careful record-keeping, and I allowed my eyes to linger on the documents, absorbing the context and beginning to recognize the hidden patterns Evelyn had maintained in parallel to our known domestic life. Charles motioned for me to sit, and I observed the exact positioning of papers on his desk, stacks of account summaries, bank statements, and emails printed in full, each sheet aligning perfectly with a note I had taken in my pocket. Notebook, the combination forming a coherent sequence of her concealed activities. I described the flow of her movements, the entrances and exits I had tracked across the corridor and elevator, the specific gestures with the folder and nameplates that indicated access privileges and decision-making authority, and I noted the subtle changes in posture, the way her head tilted when speaking into the phone, the rhythm of her stride, all details that seemed mundane to anyone else but, taken together, painted a picture of a calculated routine. Charles listened intently, occasionally typing brief notes, his attention drawn to particular numerical discrepancies that matched the movements and interactions I had observed, and he pointed to a spreadsheet where sums of transferred funds aligned with certain dates and times I had recorded, highlighting the specific amounts of $125,000, $80,000, and $200,000 in sequences that demonstrated the systematic nature of her hidden management. I leaned slightly forward, noting the pattern of deposits, withdrawals, and reallocations across different accounts, and Charles remarked quietly on the precision, noting that the records suggested a level of financial oversight beyond ordinary comprehension, a capability that had been consistently hidden from me. I examined a printed email thread on the desk, observing the timestamps, the specific wording, the subtle phrasing that indicated Evelyn's strategic planning and intentional obfuscation of her activities, and I felt a growing clarity as the numerical and behavioral patterns aligned, the sequence of events forming a mosaic of her concealed life. I described the arrangement of the office items, the position of her laptop, the angle of the monitor, the way the documents were stacked, the presence of a small nameplate indicating her role as director of operations, details that added context and credibility to the financial data we were analyzing. Charles highlighted specific transactions, and I cross-referenced them with my mental map of her routines, noting how the time of day, the sequence of movements, and the methodical handling of documents all reinforced the evidence of her secret management. We reviewed the financial trail of $2,350,000, noting each date and the method of transfer, cross-checked with the timeline of her movements through various office buildings, and I observed how even minor details, such as the placement of a paperweight or the angle of a binder, served as subtle indicators of her routine and deliberate organization. The ambient sounds of the office, the low murmur of conversation, the clicking of keyboards, the faint shuffle of papers, became a backdrop for concentrated analysis, each sound a cue in our mapping of her activities. I outlined how she had used ordinary office objects to conceal extraordinary responsibility, how each folder, pen, and nameplate became part of a larger narrative, and how the evidence aligned with years of seemingly innocuous behavior at home. Charles pointed to anomalies in the statements, small variances that suggested intentional diversion or timing strategies, and I noted the consistency of these patterns across multiple sources, the cumulative data forming a comprehensive picture. We paused briefly, absorbing the implications, and I reflected on the meticulousness of her concealment, the skill and patience it required, and the way she had orchestrated her hidden life while maintaining the appearance of an ordinary routine. The Mont Blanc pen remained in my hand, a tactile reminder of observation and precision, and I prepared to capture photographs and create copies of the key evidence for further analysis, ensuring that every detail was preserved and verifiable. Charles remarked on the significance of the findings, the combination of financial oversight, physical movement, and object placement, and together we began to draft a plan for how to monitor ongoing activities and corroborate the evidence, all without alerting Evelyn to the awareness that had developed. The office remained quiet, the sun moving through the windows, casting subtle patterns on the floor and desk surfaces, and I cataloged every detail in real time, mentally rehearsing the sequence of events I had observed, the steps I would take next, and the methodical approach required to confirm the full scope of the situation. Each recorded gesture, each documented transfer, each environmental cue contributed to a growing understanding, the analytical framework expanding as we prepared for the next phase, when the scale of Evelyn's secret life would be revealed in full, the combination of personal observation and professional analysis converging to establish clarity and insight. I felt the weight of the evidence, the responsibility to act with precision and discretion, and as we concluded the session, Charles whispered a remark that carried the first hint of astonishment, signaling that the next steps would confirm not only the hidden financial power she wielded, but also the intricate coordination of her daily movements, leaving me poised at the edge of understanding with the certainty that further revelations awaited just beyond our current view. I spread the documents across Charles Norton's desk, each sheet carefully aligned, and I began mapping out the transactions, the sums, and the sequences with the precision of a long-practiced engineer. The first record was a transfer of $125,000 dated March 3rd, a wire from Evelyn's secondary account into an offshore holding I had never known existed, and I noted it with a subtle nod, the Mont Blanc pen moving steadily in my hand. Next, a series of withdrawals and deposits. $80,000 on March 10th, $65,000 on March 17th, $200,000 on April 2nd, each movement methodically executed, each timestamp confirming a rhythm that had been invisible within the ordinary flow of our lives. I traced the total across the years, $2,350,000 moved, hidden in plain sight, yet perfectly documented, and I felt the weight of this knowledge pressing against the calm exterior I maintained. Charles pointed to a ledger with smaller amounts, the cumulative effect reaching nearly $1 million within 18 months, and together we reconstructed the broader timeline, linking dates to specific locations, meetings, and office movements, each point reinforcing the scale of her concealed operations. I examined the annotations, the notes Evelyn had left on spreadsheets, the subtleties in the phrasing that indicated intentional redirection, careful framing, and the illusion of normalcy, and I realized how meticulously she had maintained the facade, every minor detail orchestrated to mask her authority. The sunlight shifted across the desk, glinting off paper clips and the metal edge of a closed folder, and I took a deep breath, cataloging the visual cues as part of the data. I observed Charles typing a series of formulas into the spreadsheet, calculating totals, reconciling discrepancies, each calculation revealing yet another layer of financial movement that had previously gone unnoticed. I cross-referenced each item with the dates I had noted following Evelyn through the halls, the sequence of access, the order in which documents were moved or signed, and I built a mental map of her patterns, connecting behaviors to financial outcomes, the harmony between action and consequence precise and deliberate. The Mont Blanc pen shifted slightly in my hand as I tapped it against the ledger, marking the point where one set of transfers ended and another began, a subtle physical cue that reinforced my mental indexing. I noted the alignment of digital evidence and physical documents, emails printed with timestamps corresponding to financial transactions, the careful way Evelyn had masked her hand in minor, inconspicuous gestures, and the deliberate placement of office supplies to control the flow of observation. Charles drew attention to the cumulative total in bold, $2,350,000, each figure verified, each sequence cross-checked, and I felt the clarity of scale settle in, the tangible reality of the resources managed without my knowledge. I reflected on the timeline, aligning it with holidays, meetings, and trips that I had taken for granted, realizing that every ordinary date had a corresponding transfer or adjustment that had contributed to the larger financial structure she maintained. My eyes moved between the ledgers and the emails, the order of entries, the calculated spacing of amounts, and I recorded it all mentally, reinforcing each connection, each pattern, until the full scope emerged, a decade-long orchestration, perfectly aligned with routines and appearances that had seemed mundane. Charles suggested checking cross-account interactions, and I nodded, noting the precision of fund allocations, the way they had been timed to avoid any suspicion, the small amounts adding up to substantial totals, hidden in plain sight, yet meticulously coordinated. I examined small annotations Evelyn had made, tiny marks in the margins indicating priority, attention, and control, subtle symbols only meaningful to her and now, to me, evidence of an extraordinary level of planning. We paused to review the full ledger, observing the interplay of minor and major transfers, the rhythm and cadence, the exactness with which she had managed these funds while maintaining the perception of a routine, ordinary life. I visualized the path of each dollar, traced the lines from one account to another, the physical locations implied by the documentation, the chain of custody across time and institutions, and I realized that the magnitude of her hidden authority had been carefully built, maintained, and concealed. Charles highlighted anomalies where amounts shifted unexpectedly, notes indicating instructions given, and I recognized the patterns as intentional, deliberate manipulations, small deviations orchestrated to provide flexibility while maintaining an appearance of consistency. The air in the office seemed to settle around us as we reviewed the totals again. $2,350,000 precisely accounted for, the combination of action, observation, and record-keeping revealing the full scope of her hidden management, each line, each annotation, each timestamp contributing to a clear and undeniable understanding of her secret domain. I leaned back slightly, feeling the solid weight of the Mont Blanc pen as a grounding point, absorbing the breadth of information, the calculated precision, the coordination of resources across time, space, and appearances, and I knew that the next step would involve careful monitoring and strategic decisions, all informed by this comprehensive and meticulously documented picture. As we concluded the review, Charles whispered under his breath, indicating a line of data that suggested a forthcoming decision or action on her part, a subtle cue that confirmed the significance of what we had uncovered and hinted at the unfolding sequence of events that would soon require deliberate and methodical intervention without alerting Evelyn to our full awareness. I positioned myself in the narrow corridor outside the 7th-floor conference room at 10 a.m., the hallway quiet except for the faint hum of the ventilation system, and I kept my back against the wall, the Mont Blanc pen in my coat pocket, my phone held low in my hand with the voice memo application already running, the screen dimmed to avoid drawing attention. The conference room had a single panel of frosted glass set into the door frame, opaque enough to obscure faces but thin enough to allow sound to pass through with minimal distortion, and I had positioned myself at the precise angle where I could hear without being visible from either end of the corridor. Evelyn's voice came through clearly, calm and measured the way I had heard it 1,000 times at dinner, over the phone, across the kitchen counter, but the content was nothing I had heard before. She was speaking to at least 2 people, based on the pauses and the shift in register when she addressed them, and she was not speaking the way an accountant speaks or the way an office administrator speaks. She was speaking the way a person speaks when they are accustomed to being listened to without interruption, when every word has been calculated in advance, and every response is already anticipated. I heard her say, clearly and without hesitation, that the Hartwell restructuring had been completed ahead of the 3rd quarter projection, that the reallocation of the secondary accounts had reduced their visible exposure by 40%, and that the board review scheduled for the following month would see only the surface documentation, nothing that connected to the offshore holding established in 2021. I pressed the phone slightly closer to the wall and held my breathing steady, feeling the weight of each word as it registered, the precision of what she was describing corresponding exactly to the account structures Charles and I had mapped out that morning, the numbers aligning with the transfers, the timeline matching the pattern we had reconstructed from the ledgers. She paused, and one of the others in the room said something I could not fully distinguish, and she responded without missing a beat. The total move since 2018 was not their concern, she said, because it had been structured correctly, documented in layers, and there was no single document that told the whole story. The whole story existed only in her head and in the records she maintained personally, and those records followed a system no one else had access to. I noted the exact phrasing and the timestamp on the voice memo, 10:07 a.m. I noted the confidence in her delivery, the absence of any hesitation or qualification, the way she described the concealment not as something she had been forced into, but as something she had designed with care over years. There was satisfaction in her voice, the particular satisfaction of someone who has executed a long-term plan and watched it hold up under conditions they had anticipated. I recognized that satisfaction because I had felt something similar in my own work, the quiet pride of an engineer whose calculations do not fail under load, and hearing it in her voice in this context carried a weight I had not expected. She was still speaking when I began to move carefully back down the corridor, the voice memo still running, each word being captured with the same quiet precision I had applied to every observation since 8:40 that morning. I reached the stairwell door and eased it open without sound, the metal cool against my palm, and I heard Evelyn say, in a tone that carried no doubt and no apology, "No one outside this room has ever known the full scope of what we built, and no one ever will." Back at Charles Norton's office at 10:20 a.m., I set my briefcase on the floor and transferred the voice memo from my phone to his encrypted laptop while he cleared space on his desk. We listened to the recording twice. Charles said nothing during either playback. When it ended the second time, he leaned back in his chair and said, "That is a confession." I nodded and opened my notebook. We had discussed the action sequence before I entered the building that morning, and now we executed it without deviation. Charles drafted the governance filing first, a certified communication addressed to Patricia Hale, who served as secretary to the company's board oversight committee, and the filing cited the financial records, the transfer documentation, and the audio recording as grounds for an immediate operational review and account hold. No accusations, no demands, simply a formal request, professionally worded, that no modifications be executed on any referenced account pending independent review. It went out at 10:31 a.m. I called David Rice at 10:35 a.m. He was a financial forensics specialist I had worked alongside during a structural audit in Chicago 7 years earlier. I described the transfer architecture without identifying any parties, and he said within 2 minutes that the pattern was consistent with a multi-entity layered concealment structure, one designed to distribute ownership across offshore and domestic accounts in a way that made no single document tell the complete story. I thanked him and wrote the time of his confirmation in the margin of my notebook, 10:38 a.m. Charles sent the second notice at 10:39 a.m., a formal preservation request directed to the financial institution holding the primary account, asking that the complete transaction history be locked for modification pending legal review. The confirmation code came back within 90 seconds. I recorded it in the notebook. The Mont Blanc pen felt steady in my hand, its weight familiar, the same weight it had carried since the morning Evelyn gave it to me as a Christmas gift, and I had thanked her without ever reading the engraving. At 10:43 a.m., Charles submitted a written request to the company's external auditing firm, asking that all review documentation from the 3 most recent fiscal years be preserved and held available for governance committee access within 72 hours. That was the 4th and final action on the list. I set the pen down on the corner of the desk and looked at the surface in front of me, the printed ledger. Pages, the photographic documentation from the building, the time-stamped voice memo file on the laptop screen, the confirmation codes in my notebook, the certified filing receipt from Patricia Hale's office. Everything that had started in a lobby at 8:40 that morning with a security guard's quiet warning had, in just over 2 hours, become a documented and legally preserved record that could not be recalled or rerouted. Charles looked up from the laptop and said, "She will know something moved the moment Hale processes that filing." I put the Mont Blanc pen back in my coat pocket, closed the notebook, and said, "Then we are exactly where we need to be." At 10:44 a.m. my phone vibrated once, and I stepped into the hallway outside Charles's office to check the screen. Patricia Hale's office had opened and flagged the filing for priority review. I had been standing in the corridor less than a minute when I heard Evelyn's voice from the far end of the hall near the stairwell, sharper than I had heard it all morning. No longer the measured tone of someone presenting to a room, but the clipped, deliberate speech of someone who has just discovered the ground has shifted beneath her. I moved to the alcove beside the water fountain and held still. She was on her phone, pacing in a slow, tight line, and her voice carried clearly in the quiet corridor. "I need you to pull the Hartwell documentation off the secondary server tonight," she said. "Not tomorrow. Tonight." A pause. "No. I understand what the governance flag means. That is exactly why it has to move now." Another pause. "Tell the assistant to reroute the March through June transfers under the operating budget category, the same way we handled the 2021 audit. It held then, and it will hold now." I kept my breathing even, my back flat against the wall of the alcove, the Mont Blanc pen motionless in my coat pocket. I could see the faint reflection of her silhouette in the polished surface of the fire door at the end of the hall, her posture harder and more reactive than anything I had observed all morning, a person recalculating at speed. She said, "Whoever filed that notice has access to the account sequence. That is not a coincidence, and it is not a stranger." A pause. "Find out who submitted the governance request through Hale's office, and call me back in 15 minutes. She ended the call and stood still for a moment, one long exhale, before she straightened her jacket and walked back toward the 5th-floor suite with the same controlled stride she had used all day. I waited 30 seconds, then walked back into Charles's office and told him exactly what I had heard, word for word, every instruction she had given. Charles opened a new document and began typing without comment. When I finished, he looked up and said, "She just gave us the second recording we needed, and she gave it in her own words." I arrived at the main office of the company at precisely 11:45 a.m., the building quiet except for the faint hum of the ventilation system and the subtle click of my shoes on the polished marble floor. I carried the meticulously organized folders, the photographic evidence, and the ledger copies, arranging them on the long conference table where the board of directors would convene, each document positioned to ensure clarity and immediate comprehension. The Mont Blanc pen remained in my pocket, its weight a grounding force as I reviewed the sequence of steps I had taken to this point. The pattern of Evelyn's hidden operations laid bare across the surfaces before me. The first board member entered, followed by others, their expressions casual until they noticed the spread of documents, photographs, and spreadsheets aligned with exact precision, and I observed the subtle shifts in posture, the small intake of breath, the narrowing of eyes as they scanned the contents, absorbing the data and the implications of what had been concealed for so many years. I began presenting the overview, detailing the specific financial movements, the cumulative total of $2,350,000, the dates, the transaction types, and the corresponding physical behaviors observed over the past months, each point illustrated with evidence, photographs, and notes correlating movement, gesture, and timing. Evelyn entered the room at 11:55 a.m., her expression calm, unaware of the precise documentation that had been gathered, and I continued my methodical presentation, pointing out sequences of transfers and annotations, showing how each aligned with previously overlooked gestures, the arrangement of folders, and interactions with her assistant. I noticed her slight tightening of the jaw, the subtle furrow in her brow, yet she remained outwardly composed, unaware that the cumulative weight of evidence had already been established. I walked the board members through the cross-reference data, aligning visual documentation with digital records, the patterns becoming increasingly undeniable, the orchestration and planning clearly demonstrated, and each layer reinforcing the evidence of concealed control over operations and finances. The hum of the air conditioning and distant office noise contrasted with the gravity of the moment, the board members leaning closer, scanning each photograph, ledger, and annotation, the details becoming more striking with each comparison, the coherence of the hidden operations emerging with undeniable clarity. I highlighted the specific annotations indicating dates, amounts, and sequences of document handling, emphasizing the consistency and repetition across years, illustrating how every microaction supported the larger framework of deliberate concealment. Evelyn shifted slightly, scanning the documents from her side of the table, her movements precise, yet she had not anticipated the comprehensive correlation between her gestures, her financial management, and the observations that had been systematically documented. I traced the path of each transaction, each file, each annotation, ensuring that the board members understood the connection between observed actions and verified financial outcomes, the full scope of her authority and discretion becoming fully evident. The Mont Blanc pen now rested on the table in front of me, a small tactile anchor as I continued to detail the evidence, linking every gesture, every annotated document, every movement with the corresponding monetary flow, illustrating the deliberate orchestration of a hidden professional life alongside the appearance of routine domestic and office behavior. I noted Evelyn's subtle glances at the assistant, the faint nods exchanged, the quiet acknowledgement of routine, and I highlighted how these interactions, seemingly minor, contributed to the orchestration and concealment, revealing the structure of command and the coordination underlying the operations. As I concluded the detailed mapping, I allowed a moment of silence to settle over the room, letting the cumulative evidence be absorbed, the precise sequences and totals drawing a clear picture of long-term planning and hidden authority. Evelyn's posture shifted as she realized that the observations, photographs, and ledgers created a complete, verifiable record that could not be easily contested. Her composure maintained outwardly, yet subtly acknowledging the unavoidable clarity of the assembled facts. I noted the expressions of the board members, the small gestures of surprise, the slight adjustments of posture as the full implications of the information became evident, and I recognized that the careful documentation and presentation had achieved a critical turning point. The previously hidden scale of control, authority, and financial management now fully revealed. I reviewed the final totals, the alignment of annotations, the correspondence between behavior and transactions, and the coherence of the evidence, understanding that the next steps would formalize the outcome, establishing accountability and oversight. The air in the room seemed to hold a quiet tension, the hum of machinery and distant conversation forming a backdrop to the realization that every detail had been meticulously observed, recorded, and correlated, culminating in an incontrovertible presentation of long-hidden operational authority and financial oversight. Evelyn remained poised, the assistant quietly observing, and I prepared mentally for the final confirmation, understanding that the deliberate, methodical documentation had led to a comprehensive and irreversible revelation, the full weight of evidence now clearly established for the institutional and legal acknowledgement that was imminent. I stepped out into the quiet of the lobby at 12:15 p.m., the Mont Blanc pen still in my pocket as a grounding weight, and glanced at Charles Norton beside me, observing the reactions of the assistant and Evelyn as they processed the culmination of the carefully documented evidence. The sun streamed through the tall windows, reflecting off the marble floor, casting long, precise lines across the arrangement of folders, photographs, and ledgers I had meticulously organized, each item confirming the patterns of hidden authority and financial oversight that had gone unnoticed for years. Evelyn sat at the far end of the room, maintaining an outward composure, but subtle cues, a tightened grip on a folder, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a subtle shift of posture, indicated awareness of the thoroughness of our work. I carefully moved through the evidence, ensuring that the sequence of documentation aligned perfectly with the timeline of her movements, the annotations, the spreadsheets, and the photographic records, each reinforcing the clarity of understanding that had been painstakingly established. Charles whispered briefly, pointing to a set of calculations that traced the exact flow of $2,350,000, the series of transfers, the alignment with office behavior, and I noted how each number corresponded to a specific gesture, a movement, or a document, forming a complete and undeniable map of concealed authority. The assistant glanced at Evelyn and then back at the evidence, her eyes widening slightly as she realized the meticulous coordination of observations, recordings, and annotations, and I cataloged her reactions as part of the overall assessment, noting the subtle interplay of awareness and recognition. I arranged the final stack of documents, aligning them with photographs of the office, spreadsheets of transactions, and the ledger copies, creating a cohesive, easily navigable presentation that allowed for immediate comprehension of the scope and scale of her operations. I guided Charles through the sequence one final time, correlating every observed action with the corresponding record, emphasizing the precise alignment of time, place, and behavior, the physical evidence confirming the meticulous orchestration of a hidden life. Evelyn adjusted her chair slightly, her fingers tracing the edge of a document, and I observed how even minor movements were significant in understanding the extent of control she had maintained, her awareness now fully engaged with the accumulation of evidence presented. I walked carefully to the large windows overlooking the street, noting the shifting light, the movement of people below, and how each reflection cast subtle shadows across the room that highlighted the arrangement of the desk, the placement of the folders, and the sequence of evidence that documented her concealed authority. Charles and I reviewed the cumulative totals, noting the consistency of transactions, the precision of dates and amounts, and the correlation with physical behaviors and gestures, and I recorded each observation silently, allowing the weight of clarity to settle in the space around us. I stepped closer to the central table, ensuring that each item was visible, accessible, and clearly aligned with the timeline of observation, the arrangement serving as a visual representation of control, diligence, and meticulous planning that had been hidden for years. Evelyn shifted once more, her gaze sweeping the room, and I noticed the micro-expressions, slight flinches, the tightening of a jaw, a brief pause in movement, that signaled the recognition of the completeness and precision of the documentation. I carefully observed the interaction between Evelyn and her assistant, the subtle cues, the silent acknowledgments, and the controlled gestures that maintained the appearance of routine, and I integrated these observations into the final mental mapping of the operation. Charles leaned slightly forward, highlighting key sequences on the spreadsheet that demonstrated the systematic flow of resources and decisions, and I noted the correspondence between each sequence and the actions previously observed. The pattern of concealed authority now fully articulated and undeniable. I adjusted the arrangement of the documents one final time, verifying the order, the clarity, and the visibility, ensuring that anyone reviewing the materials could follow the sequence without ambiguity, the integration of physical, photographic, and digital records forming an incontrovertible chain of evidence. I looked at Evelyn one last time, noting her calm exterior contrasted with subtle signs of realization, and understood that the comprehensive presentation of evidence had achieved its intended clarity, revealing the extent of previously hidden authority, control, and financial management. The sunlight shifted again across the marble, highlighting the aligned evidence and reflecting off surfaces, and I observed how the space itself emphasized the meticulous arrangement, the careful observation, and the completeness of documentation. The Mont Blanc pen in my pocket remained a tangible anchor as I stepped back, reviewing the scene, noting the reactions of each person in the room, and confirming that the culmination of observation, recording, and methodical analysis had reached its intended resolution. Evelyn's assistant gave a slight nod toward Charles, a quiet acknowledgement of the accuracy and thoroughness of the work, and I understood that the process was complete, the operational control fully documented, the evidence indisputable, and the path for measured, informed action fully prepared. I allowed a moment to absorb the clarity, the structured outcome, and the sense of completion that had been achieved through patient observation, meticulous recording, and careful analysis, knowing that the next steps would follow naturally from this comprehensive foundation, leaving the final resolution both clear and controlled.